They say every town keeps one story that will not die, a tale that hums beneath ordinary conversation, a wound in the map where people pause and look away. In the valley where the river sweeps wide and slow, the story was always the same, about an old timber bridge and the fog that came to it. The bridge had been built in another age, the kind of place where men measured distance in days rather than miles. Its planks were a hand's width narrower than modern comfort, its rails knit by weather and the work of hands that understood the grain of wood. People crossed it once when the road ran that way, and then, when a new span and straight highway rerouted the carts and horses, the old bridge was left to the weather. It sat like an old sentinel, hunched over the water, its pilings sunk in the slow brown current. It was not the bridge's decrepitude that frightened townsfolk. Old things are not inherently sinister in such places. They are measured, kept, and repaired because small towns know the usefulness of memory. What frightened them was the fog. Not the ordinary river mist parents warned children away from on stormy mornings, a soft, silver breath that lifted in the sun. This fog came as a blanket of absence. It swallowed sound and light, softening the world into great emptiness, and it gathered always at the bridge like a congregation around an altar. The rules of the stories were consistent. The fog came at certain times, thickly at dusk and early in the hours before dawn, sometimes arriving like a curtain dropped from a theater rigging. If you stood at the riverbank and watched the bridge when the fog came, you would see it extend. Boards that had once ended at a simple span would lengthen into distance that a person's eye refused to accept. Feet that had taken 10 steps grew to 20, 30, until the bridge seemed to reach beyond the river into a world that might not have belonged to this one. People told of footsteps heard in the fog, of echoing timbers that answered a single footfall long after the walker had passed its beam. They told of lanterns seen moving at the far side of the planks when no one stood there at dawn, of voices that spoke names and then stopped. They told, in hushed voices, of those who had walked out into the fog and vanished. Uncle Tomas who went for wood and never returned. Lila, who crossed the bridge at dusk because a boy dared her. A shopkeeper who thought to fetch a lost dog. The townsfolk treated truth as something to be refined by caution. They avoided the bridge when the fog hung low. They made sure lights were trimmed and shutters latched. But stories have teeth. They gnaw at curiosity. A visitor hears legend told with a fold of the lips and thinks how marvelous, how quaint, until the story settles and makes itself home like a seed in thought. A seed, if watered by loneliness or the wrong sort of bravery, can sprout. The visitor in that spring was Jonah. He was not supposed to be a central figure in any story. He had come to the valley on impulse, taking a break from the pulsing city after a relationship ended and a job shifted. In the town he took a room above the bakery, and by day he walked the banks of the river and drank coffee in the one bookstore that still kept the lights on till late. People liked him in a way towns like visitors. He asked things they had learned to forget, and he listened with a genuine appetite for oddities. When the fog story came up, Jonah laughed the way a man in a hurry to believe the world's sensible laughs. But he stored the details away, as one does, in the pocket of a curious mind. The first time Jonah saw the fog, it was at dusk. He had been walking the river path, and the light folded into itself slowly, like linen creasing. The air cooled. The town behind him seemed to ease, the clamor of engines and human business pulling back like tide. The river slowed its voice, and on the far bank the old bridge crouched. Then the fog rolled, an approaching gray that turned the outlines of the bridge to a suggestion. Jonah stopped, boots in the mud at the water's edge, and watched as the planks reached. There was a wrongness to the extension, a sense that distance had been borrowed from some other measure of space. A heartless engineering could have been behind it, an optical effect like that found in deserts or wet concrete. Still, when Jonah stepped forward toward the planks, something tightened in his chest. The fog smelled of wet linen and iron. It damped the sound of his footfall into something like the muffled beating of a crypt. He took 2 steps. The wood gave a modest groan under his weight. The fog closed. He stopped. Something moved across his peripheral glance. An absence more than an object, a darker seam in the gray, like a figure without a face. Jonah left then, retreating to the town with a rational mind making rational notes. He told himself he would not return when the fog thickened again. The town citizens, unsurprisingly, repeated their practical warnings. But a story is an invitation as much as a caution. At night the image of the bridge repeated, folded into the quiet like a thin blade pressed into sleep. There is a hunger that curiosity fosters, and Jonah had brought that hunger with him. He would cross that bridge before long, not because he thought to defy the tale but because the story, in the soft hours of insomnia, began to sound like a summons. The second time Jonah approached the bridge, the fog had come like a weight. The town's lamps pushed halos into whiteness and then surrendered them. Where he had stood before and felt a passing chill, now there was a deepening hush as though the world had been taped over its ears. Jonah walked slowly, the boards underfoot whispering in slivers, and noticed with a kind of flinch that the distance felt different. The far rail receded slightly, then steadied. Strangely, the bridge did not look old on that side. It wore an unfamiliar patina, as though its wood had been renewed by waters beyond seeing. He was not alone in the fog. There came those who said in town that they had seen lights, lanterns bobbing on the far span like low-meaning stars. Others insisted they heard voices calling, thin as a thread. Jonah, carrying only a flashlight, found that the beam sliced little more than an elbow of gray. The fog drank it. The first third of the crossing remained like any simple span. The planks were creaky, the rails slick with moisture. A man might imagine the rest was an old man's prop, an extended memory, a stretched imagination. But Jonah felt the bridge tighten around him in a way that could not be measured by footfall. He heard stepping behind, for a second, a footfall out of rhythm, and he turned. A shadow stood at the midpoint. It was upright and still, like a stake. It had no features to name. But in the folding fog it suggested a body and suggested a face, and where most people see faces and name them, he saw only the wrongness of incompleteness. It was as if some painter had traced an outline and then refused to finish. The shadow never moved, but its presence was a pressure. It exerted something like intent. Jonah's breath came close and favored his chest. He shouted once, a short animal noise from his throat, and the sound dissolved immediately in the fog. No answer returned. He continued. He had no reasonable explanation for why he could not turn back. The sense he might be tethered to the bridge by a small unseen cord, an unwise loyalty, clung to him like a damp shirt. Somewhere near the center the planks lengthened by a fraction, and he realized with a sudden dizziness that his memory of the river and the far bank had altered. The bank should have been closer, with a line of hawthorns. Now the world beyond the railing was only fog and dim suggestion. When Jonah reached 3/4 of the way, he thought he felt wind. It was not wind as the town knew it. It was like breath in caves, slow and methodical. He stopped walking. The shadow stepped forward. It did not take much space. Perhaps a step, or perhaps the fog filled the same position. There was no sound of wood, no clack of foot. It merely shifted like a thought takes shape. Jonah felt a tide inside his skull. Memories not his tugged. Faces of people he had not known rose like smoke, laughter from long-dead rooms, a childhood song. He took another cautious step and the planks lengthened again. The further he moved forward, the less able he was to judge motion. Time began to loosen its seams. He also began to notice changes in himself. A slow thinning, an erosion, like paint rubbed off a statue's cheek. Names faltered at the end of his tongue. He was less able to hold a thought long enough to feel it entirely. Fear did not feel like fear so much as an exhausted knowledge. He wanted to run but lacked the energy to summon full panic. He wanted to call out, to call someone, anyone, but speech shrank into a paper whisper. At the bridge's center the silence was a living thing. He stopped and placed his hand on the wet rail, feeling the rough knotting of the wood. For a moment, a terrible moment, he thought the rail had texture like skin, and when he looked down he saw not the river but a slow lunging field of pale faces, mouths long and thin and opening along the current. He turned and began walking backward. Each step he took shortened the bridge slightly. The fog thinned. The town's lampposts became humble again. The far rail gained proximity. Jonah shouted then, a real sound, and that sound echoed back from the boat moored upstream in a way that made his voice thin and small. He made the riverbank with the panting of someone who has seen a thing meant to be unseen. That night in restlessness, he dreamed of boards extinguishing into miles and miles of fog and the endless light of lost lamps. He dreamed of a face that wouldn't arrange itself, of a voice that might be his calling him back. But the town slept, and he was alive. He told himself he would never return. Foolishness has its seasons. The story had a name for men like Jonah, people with curiosity like an open wound. The fog has patience, stories have appetite. The first crossing marked edges but did not take him wholly. You might think that the first step is the hardest. Often the second is the one that sows the seam. For a short time after the crossing, Jonah claimed a rational life. He ate at the diner, he bought stamps, he attempted to sleep without images of the fog. But the bridge, like a slow infection, began to press upon him. The days seemed to warp. Once bright afternoons could fold into thin, hungry twilight. Sounds, footsteps, doors, lost their source. Men he had met showed less recognition than should have been had. His hands would tremble over small tasks. The more he tried to anchor himself, the more the world around him inclined toward the river. Other things disappeared. People in town left plain spaces where shelves once were. A boy named Harlan failed to return from his errand. The grocer's wife went to gather water and never came back. The stories thickened like spilled ink. With each loss, the parish coffee hour became quieter, less daring in its speculation. Some of the losses were old, an uncle's name gone for years. Some were recent, neighbors who'd seemed solid as stones simply vanished in the thinnest of air. The town did not link these disappearances with the bridge at first. Loss is subtle. But when 2 nights of fog passed and another figure was seen at the bridge's center, the line of connection became as obvious as a scar. Jonah found himself standing at windows at odd hours, watching the river like a man waiting for a tide to bring back a body. A thread tugged at him, a small, persistent sensation that something in him had been promised across the span. He tried to recall the names of his youth, childhood friends, a teacher with a large laugh, and felt their letters slide into fog. He wrote lists and left them crumpled, pages ripped at their creases. It was as if his inner content leaked. Ethan, who had become a friend though not from city days, watched his fellow with a worry that is measured in heavier breaths. "You're going back," Ethan said once, an accusation more than a question. Jonah did not meet his eyes. "I don't know what that is," he answered, which was true. He did not know whether it was compulsion or the stretching of something promised. He only knew that the pull felt like a fault line yawning beneath his feet. Several nights later, he crossed again. This time the experience was worse because the fog had thickened into density. Its smell filled his nostrils like iron. The planks seemed to pulse. He walked slowly, trying to keep thought in a small, manageable sphere, the feel of his boot on wood, the sensation of cool air on his face. But the fog responded, and memories he would rather not have remembered came to him as if by statute. Faces flitted like pages in a book, the grocer's wife with flour on her sleeve, the fisherman with his old hat, the mayor's laugh. They looked to him with eyes that were not fully there and whispered, not with air, but with the curious ache of remembered music. At the halfway point, Jonah felt the cord of the bridge tighten. The sensation was not external. It was internal. A thread wrapped around the bones inside his chest. When he tried to step back, his feet weighed as though filled with earth. The shadow that had stood on an earlier crossing had no single shape now. It moved, indistinct, a drift of a thing that takes human form for a step and then another. It pointed, if a dark could gesture, and the direction of its index seemed not to be across the river but farther into fog where things might be waiting for him. His steps became mechanical. He walked and walked, the rail under his palms softening into a warmth like blood. The fog pressed at his face. Voices rose in a chorus, not speaking phrases but humming the tremors of being. For him, memory became the currency the bridge took. For every half step, a memory unlaced itself and fell into the river with the sound of a bell. He could not tell whether minutes or hours went by. He reached, at last, a place that felt like the bridge's heart. A knotted plank with rings like an old wound, and all around him the fog thickened into particular shapes, houses suspended in white, windows that glowed with the suggestion of rooms. Faces appeared in those windows, faces he recognized at first, then could not place. They smiled without meaning. He realized then that the other side was not a distant shore but a mirror world. It didn't imitate his valley so much as interpret it through a dream. The houses were suggestions of houses. The skies were white, but the air tasted like old iron and a memory of ivory piano keys. The bridge itself stretched endlessly beyond sight. The planks underfoot were no longer wood but something like the inside of an old thing opening. A terrible stillness, like a poised instrument before the strike, filled him. Shapes moved in the fog. Some of them looked like people Jonah used to know. They called to him, and he felt a motion like drowning rise in his throat. He wondered if he would ever remember how to walk away. At some deep place he had not known he possessed, a decision formed. It was not thought but a kind of surrender, to cross entirely, to reach the other side where voices murmured and where the world would be remade. He wanted to be remade. He wanted perhaps to be forgiven for being a city man in a quiet place, for the slow ache of loneliness. He wanted an end to the unknowing that pressed on his mind. He took another step. There were men who believed that places keep records of those who pass through them. Bridges may be, in some old cosmology, not merely spans of wood but thresholds that remember. The valley remembered. And memory is not always a benevolent thing. Those who had once seen Jonah after a crossing reported that he looked different. His eyes were a little more distant. His clothes smelled faintly of river iron. He spoke less. He walked like a man who had learned a strange cadence. He told Ethan, in a voice like a closing door, that the other side was not empty but, not for us, not in the same way. He retracted and pressed himself to other listeners. He did not, however, admit that he had been tempted to remain. Other people did not fare as mildly. Sometimes the bridge did not return a person the same. Those who vanished did not simply stop existing. Their absence altered the town's texture. Chairs at the cafe sat alone for weeks. Boots leaned against walls and grew dusty. A neighbor's children left a game half-finished in the square. The wares in a shop remained on the shelves until they rotted, and the absence of the shopkeeper was a new silence. Jonah himself came to understand the mechanism somewhat. The bridge drew not only the footsteps of those who walked it but fed on the habit of remembering. The fog on the other side kept a person in halves, part memory, part suggestion. The more one drank of it, the more one's edges blurred. The town was slowly collecting its missing in a museum of pale reflections. It was not a hell of flames and shrieks but a country of hush where voices repeated the same phrases over and over, hollow and calm. It would be easy to say that his mind then split into compartments. This is the rational account a man tells when he is frightened by his own mind. The other account, the one that presses at the center of the chest, is that at each crossing Jonah lost a little of himself. A favorite song misplaced, a name of an old friend that thinned like paper held to a light, a memory of color that returned only as fog. The bridge took these as if they were tolls. He paid and paid until he could not be sure which pieces of him were his and which were the bridge's. He began to dream the other bank awake. At times he thought he saw his bedroom reflected there with windows open and himself as a child, and at other times he watched himself reflected in window panes along the span like someone he had once known from a boarding house. On the other bank the air was more forgiving. The fog allowed a person to breathe memories like sleep. The temptation to step across and not return was a constant drum. The town, seeing more disappearances, grew taut with a new fear that was both old and practical. People began to travel at pairs to fetch water. They hung bells. Men staked charred ironides into the planks. Old women chanted against the weight of the thing. But the fog was patient. It does not give in to makeshift defenses. It does not find boundaries of men's rights compelling. Ethan, who had watched Jonah from the beginning, finally vowed to do something more than staying awake with worry. He began reading old ledgers and town diaries, unearthing names and dates and a pattern that stretched back more than a century. The bridge had been claimed in slow cycles, not continuous but periodic, as if it awoke certain seasons when some internal hunger aligned with weather and will. Once, long ago, an entire work crew had gone missing during a repair. Later, a traveler caravan did not return from a crossing made in moonlight. Ethan took his notes to the others and they planned, in ways that felt useless and heroic both. They would watch the bridge. They would stop people from walking it. They would ring bells and stand in pairs, and if someone left or made the choice to go, they would follow and drag them back. They failed. Good intentions in the face of places that know you are small can be like paper against tide. The nights fell and men bowed to their own fears. People watched with watchfulness that only postponed collapse. There came a night when the fog was a thick cloth, and the bridge hummed with many voices. In the pale heart of its shapes moved like branches in a storm. A group of the townsfolk, Ethan among them, went to the bank to confront the fog or some superstition of the town. They spoke low as the bridge moaned and opened away like an animal yawning. A woman stepped forward from the bank, Mrs. Halvorson, who made quilts and brought soup to sick neighbors, a woman whose life was constellated with kindness, and she walked the first planks. Her hands were steady at first. Then they trembled. Men called after her, words of caution, of pleading. She waved them away once, and then she was swallowed by the mist. No amount of shouting changed the bridge's appetite. Ethan reached forward, he thought, to grab her cuff, but his fingers passed through a light that was not resistance but a relinquishing. The planks lengthened. Her shape became less whole and then she was gone. Ethan ran to the edge and called into the fog. The fog answered with the sound of a bell and a voice that was like a remembered lullaby. It put images into his head, his childhood home, his father's face, but those images were not promises of return, they were sugar to calm the jaw of the thing pulling on his mind. He staggered back as if struck, and in that stagger a man named Harlan slid forward of his own feet and crossed a threshold Ethan had dared to hope would not open. Jonah watched from the river's bank with a patience that was not benevolent. He did not call out. He turned his face to the fog, and in the dark someone thought they saw him smile. When enough people step onto a threshold, the nature of the threshold changes. You might imagine the world has a place for loss, a place where things are measured and returned. This was not such a place. Instead, the bridge accumulated a private devotion, an appetite that filled itself on the experience of crossing. The last fog came like a hand closing. It took the valley wholly. Windows in town saw only white. People barricaded themselves, they nailed shutters, they stayed close to their own hearths. Yet hunger is not a thing warded by precaution. Those who had become curious and those who had been seized both felt the same tug, an intimate calling as precise as a lover's whisper. It was the sort of voice that makes the mind drop its load. Those who remained awake heard them, sometimes through the fog and sometimes in a dream, the lost calling softly across the span as if to say, "Come, it's warm here." On the final night, the town gathered in the school gym, a small cluster of people who ate, prayed, and kept the lanterns burning. They sat with their backs to each other so as to watch across every direction. Some kept vigil in pairs along the riverbank. Yet even the bravest could not keep their eyes from darting. Late, the fog drained and thickened. Men and women kept a fierce watch. A small child pressed his face to a window and asked in a voice like a damp leaf if the people would come back. They would not. The bridge, that night, was visible only as suggestions in the white air, a shape that folded and unfolded, sometimes closer, sometimes further. Along it moved the missing and the nearly missing, shapes that were alive only in the way a cord is alive until the pluck. Their mouths worked soundlessly. Their hands reached for those who stood at the banks. The bridge seemed to move as if by its own will, contracting then extending, like a breathing thing. At some point the town noticed a pattern. Presence begets presence. One or two crossings created attention. Many crossings made the fog more magnetic. As dawn failed to lift and the gym's coffee cooled, people went out in groups to try and stop it, to pull back the ones who stepped forward, to hold them by the hand. They were not always successful. Fingers slipped. Breath snagged. Jonah was seen then, in the worst stage of the thing that had taken him. He moved across the bridge with a kind of indifferent grace. His eyes held something like love for the mist. Ethan yelled his name and had a sudden pang of a memory. When they were boys, racing through alleyways, stealing apples. The image was cruel. Jonah turned and looked at Ethan as if at a person across more than a bridge, across a long arm of years, and he mouthed something that was close to sorrow. You must understand the strangeness of the place. Grief arrives with faces, each one giving a voice and then dissolving. The people on the bridge, and the bridge itself, were not monsters in the simple senses of fairy tales. They were quotations of the people who had loved the valley. In another logic, they were permuted, kindly things, who wanted to keep a person in a stillness of perfection, a world where no one aged, and no one had to bear the shame or dullness of ordinary days. Ethan reached for Jonah and did not catch him. He felt as if something had thrust him into water. He smelled iron. He felt his own hands dissolve into the wet air. When he scrambled forward, it was not to pull Jonah to safety, it was to feel the truth of that tide. Jonah's mouth moved and the sounds that came out were layered with the voices of many who had crossed and then became chorus. The bridge's hunger, at last, proved not to be quenched by one or two souls. It wanted entire towns. It wanted memory. Some said it wanted the town's story. Others, quieter, said it wanted the living sensation of choosing to go, an act of will to make a death complete. The valley did not have reason to dispute. Loss piled upon loss. At the end, when the fog had eaten the last of the riverbank, the gym doors were opened and the townspeople emerged to a valley like one that had been drained of sound. No birds called, no water lapped. Houses stood with doors wide open. A kettle on a stove had boiled dry and then cooled. A pot of stew curdled at the side of a table. The village dogs howled and then were silent. The bridge stood empty in the dull light that remained. It looked ordinary and yet impossible. Its span composed of the same worn wood but stretching into nothing, the other side beyond comprehension. No footprints marked the planks. No lanterns glowed. The fog no longer curtained it. Instead, a clear wind passed where it had been, a sigh. People dared to cross it then, in pairs and with ropes and with torches, but the planks resisted. Those who stepped upon them found themselves suddenly on a common fact of ground, not the extension it had once been. When they reached the center of the span, they looked down and saw not water but a deep shadow, a bowl of years and echoes, and it seemed empty in the way a grave is empty until filled. Years later, if you go to that small valley on a bright day, you will see the bridge. You will note its architecture, old wood, veteran nails at the joints, an occasional plank replaced in the practical way folk repair their things. You will see the river moving at its unremarkable pace. You will feel, if you are susceptible, the small pressure at the base of your throat, the faint tug of memory recalling some wrongness, and you will perhaps decide to walk onward. If you are lucky, you will experience nothing more than the felt sense that older people had an odd superstition. If you are not, the fog might come early and you will find the planks lengthen, and you will walk, and some part of you will gladly tip into the white. Those left behind tell the story because it must be told and because telling is what keeps the bridge's appetite in check. But such stories are as leaky as any human voice. The bridge remains where it has always been, at the river, wading through years of harvest and winter, through births and deaths. It asks little. It is patient. It needs only one crossing, one willing step, the contracting of a hand from the world. When the valley finally emptied, the town's books recorded little more than the names, who had been lost, when, and under what weather. There were inquiries and petitions and a visiting professor who published a paper on optical phenomena in marshy lands. People made their theories and then went home to their dinners, to their reading lamps and to their dead, and life reassembled itself into new shapes. But whether you call it physics or hunger, the bridge keeps its counsel. It props open a passageway in the fog piece by piece, transaction by small transaction. A man goes across, and something in the other bank makes a place for him and folds him into its hush. They say you can still hear it if you stand at the river late enough in the year and the fog gathers thick. A long, low sound like a bell struck from some deep inside the earth, the footfalls of people who are walking elsewhere and will not come back. When the sound ends, there is an after silence that tastes of iron. It is only a story that people tell to keep the dark at bay. And like all stories that know what it is to hunger, it tells itself to any ear hungry enough to listen.